Okay, so if you're someone who, really enjoys thinking about the big questions like the nature of reality or how we know what we know, you're going to love this. Today we're going deep on Friedrich Albert Lange. He was a German intellectual in the 1800s, and his ideas are, they're still really relevant even now in the 21st century.
Lange, yeah, he lived from 1828 to 1875, and he wasn't just a philosopher. He was also a teacher, a political activist, and a journalist, actually. I think what really makes him stand out, though, is how he tackled those huge shifts happening back then because of science. Science was really changing how people thought about, well, everything.
Yeah.
Philosophy, politics, even education. He was a pretty important figure during that time in Germany.
That's right. And to get a full picture of him, we're looking at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Lange. It's pretty comprehensive, covers a lot of ground. But today, we're going to try to zero in on, the core of his philosophical thinking, especially the stuff that I think would appeal to, to someone who's really interested in philosophy. Like, how do we know things? What's the basis of ethics? And how do our theories actually play out in the real world?
Exactly. So our mission today is to dig up the most philosophically interesting parts of Lange's work. And there's a lot to explore. We'll be looking at his take on materialism.
Yeah.
That was a big deal back then, and his role in Neo-Kantianism. That's basically a revival of Kant's philosophy. And then there's his views on ethics, religion, even metaphysics. And we can't forget his work on logic and his political activism, too.
Lots to cover. Okay. Well, let's start with Lange's views on materialism. His book, The History of Materialism and Critique of its Contemporary Significance. I mean, that's considered a really important work.
Oh, absolutely. It had a lasting impact, even into the 20th century.
Yeah.
But to really understand what Lange was doing, you have to get the context right. This was the time of the materialism controversy. Basically, science was advancing like crazy, and it was starting to challenge traditional religious and metaphysical ideas. I mean, people were debating the very nature of reality, and where humans fit into all of it.
So where did Lange fit into all of this? Was he trying to defend the old ways against this new materialism?
Well, that's what's interesting about Lange. He didn't just reject materialism outright. He offered what you might call a sympathetic critique. He said that materialism could be useful in science, like as a tool for research, but when it tried to be a whole philosophical system, explaining everything about existence and knowledge, well, that's where he thought it ran into trouble. He thought it ended up undermining itself.
Self-undermining? How so?
Okay, so Lange was really influenced by the science of his time, especially the work of Hermann von Helmholtz, who was doing some groundbreaking research on the physiology of our senses, like our eyes and ears. Lange argued that how we see the world, literally, is shaped by how our senses are structured. He even said the sense world is a product of our organization. Think about it. Our eyes only see a tiny part of the whole electromagnetic spectrum, and our ears, well, they can only hear a certain range of sound frequencies. And then our brain takes all that limited information and creates our experience of the world.
So you're saying we don't see reality directly? It's more like our brains construct it based on, limited input.
Exactly. And Lange went even further. He said that even our concept of matter, the basic stuff of the universe, might not be an accurate reflection of how things really are, independent of us. He thought that studying physiology, how our bodies work, showed us the limits of what we can actually know. We're always dealing with a combination of the outside world and our own biological and mental frameworks. So to put it simply, he was using science to argue that what we experience is not a perfect window to reality, but something built by our biology. And that challenges the whole idea of an objective material world.
Right. That sounds a lot like Kant's ideas, transcendental idealism, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, very much so. Lange even looked at other materialist thinkers like Heinrich Zolby, who tried to come up with a version of materialism that didn't contradict itself. Zolby said that sensory qualities like colors and sounds were somehow transmitted unchanged through the nervous system and existed independently of the person perceiving them.
But Lange wasn't convinced.
Nope. He thought Zolby was basically ignoring, or maybe even twisting, the scientific evidence to make his arguments work. Lange felt like Zolby's ideas just didn't fit with what we knew about physiology. And this led Lange to a conclusion that's very Kantian. He said, a consistent materialistic view thus changes around, therefore, into a consistently idealistic view. Basically, if you try to explain knowledge purely through materialism, you end up realizing that the mind is actually shaping that knowledge.
Wow, that's a pretty big shift. So diving deep into materialism actually pushed him towards a kind of idealism, or at least a view where the mind's role in shaping reality is super important. Which brings us to Neo-Kantianism. You mentioned that Lange was one of the founders of physiological Neo-Kantianism.
That's right. He was a key figure in the Back to Kant movement. It was a response to, well, a few things. First, there was Hegelian idealism, which was the dominant philosophy in Germany at the time, but many people felt it was too abstract and out of touch with the real world. And second, there were the limitations of materialism, which we've just been talking about. So Neo-Kantianism, with Lange leading the way, was an attempt to ground philosophy in the ideas of Kant, but with a new scientific twist.
So Kant's philosophy was the way forward, but they needed to bring in the latest science.
Exactly. And the physiological part is crucial here.
Mm.
Lange and other thinkers like Helmholtz argued that new discoveries in physiology actually supported some of Kant's key ideas, especially the idea that our minds play an active role in shaping how we experience the world. So science was giving empirical evidence for Kant's more abstract philosophical framework.
So they saw science as backing up what Kant was saying about how humans understand things.
Yes, in a way. Take Helmholtz's sign theory of perception, for example. He said that our senses don't give us direct copies of the world, but more like symbols or signs that our minds interpret. Like words on a page represent ideas, but they're not the ideas themselves. This theory fit perfectly with Kant's idea that we don't experience the thing in itself directly, only how our understanding shapes it.
But didn't they have some disagreements with Kant? I mean, the thing in itself, wasn't that a sticking point?
Oh, absolutely. Lange, like Helmholtz, wrestled with the idea of the Ding in sich, the thing in itself. That's the reality that supposedly exists outside of our experience, but which Kant said we can never truly know. Later thinkers, like Ernst Mach, really criticized this concept. They asked, how can we even talk about something that's, by definition, beyond our experience?
Okay, so they were using science to support some of Kant's ideas, but also struggling with some of the problems in his philosophy. Now let's move on to ethics, religion, and metaphysics. How did Lange's Neo-Kantianism and his critique of materialism affect his views in these areas?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting for a philosopher. Lange said that metaphysics, that branch of philosophy dealing with the nature of reality, is actually a lot like art. It's a product of the human imagination. He thought it came from our deep desire to find meaning and order in the world, even when things go beyond what we can prove scientifically. So for Lange, metaphysical systems aren't necessarily giving us objective truth in the way that, say, a scientific theory might.
So metaphysics isn't a direct line to some ultimate truth.
Exactly. And this idea had big implications for his views on ethics. He looked at the ethical conclusions people often drew from materialism. He agreed that materialism could explain why people do certain things, maybe even selfish things. But he said that doesn't tell us what's morally right or wrong. Just because you can explain action through materialism doesn't make it ethical.
So he was against what he called ethical materialism.
Yeah, that's right. He didn't believe that just pursuing pleasure or material things was the same as the highest good for humans. And he was worried that this kind of limited view of human motivation could lead to problems in society like unfairness and inequality.
What about religion? Given his views on metaphysics, I'm guessing he wasn't a big believer in traditional religion.
Well, he definitely thought that science was going to challenge a lot of traditional religious beliefs, especially those based on supernatural explanations. But he wasn't dismissive of religion entirely. He was concerned about what might happen if people just abandoned religion without having anything to replace it. He worried about the social and moral consequences, if people lost that sense of shared values and ethical guidance.
So even though he didn't buy into the metaphysical claims of religion, he saw it as having a purpose, like a social function.
Yeah, you could say that. He compared religion and metaphysics to fairy tales for adults, but not in a bad way. He meant that they serve a similar purpose to art. They inspire us to be better people and help us deal with what he called spiritual impoverishment by giving us ideals and myths to believe in. He even saw a connection to Schiller's philosophical poetry and some of Kant's ideas about how imagination shapes our moral sense.
That's a really interesting comparison. But it raises a question for me. If morality is based on these imaginative creations, does that mean it's arbitrary? Does it have any real foundation? Did Lange ever address that?
That's a great point. And the Stanford entry actually mentions that Lange isn't totally clear on this. It's not obvious whether he thought morality itself was just a a kind of socially constructed myth. He definitely studied Kant's critique of practical reason and that whole idea of the fact of reason, that we seem to have an innate awareness of a universal moral law. Lange was skeptical of that at first, but some people think his views might have changed later on, maybe because of Hermann Cohen's influence. So how Lange ultimately grounded morality, well, it's still up for debate. Lots for philosophers to think about there.
Definitely a complex and maybe even a bit unclear area of his thought. Okay, let's switch gears to Lange's work on logic and scientific methodology. You said his book Logical Studies was pretty important.
It was. It's considered a key work in what's often called scientific epistemology. Basically, that's the study of scientific knowledge, how we justify it, and how we get it in the first place. In this book, Lange was really engaging with thinkers like Johann Herbart and Friedrich Adolf Trendelenburg, who had different ideas about, about how science actually works.
What were the main disagreements, and what did Lange bring to the table?
Well, Herbart, he came from a psychology background and thought that the basis of scientific methodology was ultimately psychological, like it came from how our minds worked. Trendelenburg, on the other hand, thought we needed logic to establish the certainty of scientific knowledge. Lange saw the psychological part, sure, but he ultimately sided with Trendelenburg. He argued that the sense of necessity we get from valid scientific conclusions, that couldn't just be reduced to psychology. He believed there was a logical structure there that went beyond, the subjective workings of our individual minds. So for Lange, logic had its own domain, separate from psychology, and it provided the foundation for good scientific reasoning.
So logic wasn't just a side effect of how our brains happen to work.
Exactly, and Lange actually made a pretty big contribution to formal logic itself. He showed that the old Aristotelian syllogistic, which is a way of reasoning with categories, could be completely expressed in what was then called the logic of extension. We know that as propositional logic today. And get this, he even used diagrams that were a lot like Venn diagrams, even before Venn. That just shows how forward-thinking he was when it came to logic.
Wow, that's pretty cool. A bit of a history of logic lesson there.
Right, and even more importantly, he argued that all certain or apodictic scientific inferences were basically the same at their core. It didn't matter if a conclusion came from pure reason, a priori principles, or from experiments and observations. The logical structure that made it certain was the same. This actually challenged some of Kant's core distinctions, like the analytic-synthetic distinction and the thought-intuition distinction. For Lange, all necessarily true judgments had a common logical nature, and gaining knowledge involved a back and forth between reason and our senses.
So he was a Neo-Kantian, but he wasn't afraid to disagree with Kant on some pretty fundamental points.
Yeah, he was definitely his own thinker. He even finished his logical studies with some pretty complex ideas about space and time, drawing on Neoplatonism. So when it came to logic and scientific methodology, Lange wasn't just repeating what others had said, he was carving his own path, building on tradition, but also moving beyond it.
It sounds like he was really engaged with the big intellectual questions of his time. And he didn't just stay in the ivory tower, right? You mentioned his involvement in political movements.
Absolutely. Lange's philosophical ideas were really tied to his political activism. He was involved in the workers' movements of the time, and he saw his intellectual work as a direct response to the problems he saw with materialism. He came up with the concept of socialist Darwinism, which is important to distinguish from social Darwinism.
Wait, those sound very similar. What was the difference?
Okay, so Lange agreed with Darwin on the struggle for existence and natural selection, but he absolutely rejected the idea that these principles justified social inequality. He believed that human reason and good social organization could actually overcome those struggles and create a more just society. He was active in the German Workers' Association and even had discussions with people like Marx, Engels, and Bernstein.
So he believed in using philosophy to make a difference in the real world.
Exactly. And his influence even reached into the socialist debates of the time. Edward Bernstein, a key figure in socialist thought, actually said that for him, going back to Kant really meant going back to Lange. That shows how much Lange's ideas shaped the development of socialist theory.
That's pretty impressive. So to wrap things up, what are the biggest takeaways from our deep dive into Lange's work?
Well, we saw a thinker who was deeply concerned with how scientific progress was changing our understanding of reality. His critique of materialism, which was very nuanced and rooted in science, led him to develop a sophisticated form of physiological Neo-Kantianism. He emphasized the active role our minds play in how we experience the world. And he had some profound things to say about ethics, religion, and metaphysics, suggesting that they're partly creations of our imagination but still serve important purposes in our lives and in society. And his work in logic and scientific methodology, well, that challenged some of the accepted philosophical ideas of the time and even foreshadowed later developments in logic. And all of this was connected to his commitment to social justice and his involvement in political movements.
He sounds like a true philosopher, engaged with the big questions of his time, and his ideas are still relevant today, just as you said at the beginning.
Definitely. And going back to Lange's view of metaphysics as a kind of art, it makes you wonder, how would that perspective change how we think about philosophical truth? And how does his focus on the later question, the social and economic issues of his day, how does that inform our discussions about social justice now? Those are some of the enduring questions that Lange's work raises.
Those are some great questions to end on. Thank you for taking us on this journey through the fascinating and complex world of Friedrich Albert Lange. It's always a pleasure to explore these ideas.